Okay, after a quick switch, we'll now switch to, I'm Mark Poehler, and we'll moderate this panel on a civilian perspective. The civilian perspective may be a little more amorphous and varied and less coordinated than the military one because there are so many broader perspectives to be included. We're hoping here to address some of the stagnation, perhaps in innovation that has many roots, and to give you some ideas for things that may stimulate some change in the future prospects. This panel is aspirational. What should we have? What do we need? And what do we want in patient care and to minimize clinician burnout? We can't eliminate it. Those stresses are always there. So some brief introductions to accelerate the pace of this since we're a bit behind. Dr. Ariella Goldman is a practicing OBGYN, looking for opportunities in plain sight and the deficiencies with little advancement over decades in obstetric care. Hiyam, Nadel is the director of the Center for Innovations in Healthcare Delivery, formerly an RN and OB, and now augmented by an entrepreneurship MBA from Babson College, looking for pain points and opportunities for clinicians. Dr. Paul Biddinger is an emergency physician and the Chief Preparedness and Continuity Officer for MGB. And looking for opportunities as they apply to disaster preparedness and resilience and a range of concerns from natural catastrophes to bio threats and mass casualties. And then Rob Kolodner here is the former national coordinator, the second in the days before money, as he has pointed out. He's a psychiatrist, but has been involved in the evolution of the VA health EHR system since the 1970s. I'm an anesthesiologist. I'm the department chief for the anesthesia department, also an informatician, engineering and genomics activist in the Geisinger health system in central Pennsylvania, and have been involved in standards since the 1980s. And that's how I've gotten to know Julian. So there are many things that we might talk about. You know, there are projects that have been innovative in bringing technology to low resource environments, such as the LifeBox product that brings capnography and pulse oximetry to limited resource environments. And we want to think here in terms of opportunities that we may have to address things in the civilian domain. So for the panel, we've already heard about technologies that have been developed and thinking that goes into the systems for the military. What are you seeing as opportunities in civilian applications and how these technologies might be applied? And further, how is healthcare technology ecosystem different in the civilian world than it is in the military? To kick it off, I'm going to ask Dr. Goldman to present an observation that she's made regarding management of patients in labor.
Well, thank you so much for having me here. As Dr. Poehler said, I am an OBGYN. I work primarily both in an outpatient setting, but also on the labor and delivery unit. And that's an environment that is busy, chaotic at times, high acuity, with dozens of different people working on the floor, from physicians, physician assistants, midwives, RNs, anesthesiologists, and all there to take care of the patients in front of us. Spending my time on the floor, I'm in charge of monitoring the patient who's there and who's pregnant, but also the fetus. And we do that through mostly external fetal monitoring for fetal heart rate, and also a tachometer to look at contraction pattern. And those two pieces of information, we are then charged to interpret and then provide further patient care going forward. That could be for continuing labor management, vaginal delivery, deciding for a cesarean section, whatever the outcome may be. And one thing that we're often working in a silo on the floor in a sense, where we'll be asking, why are we doing things a certain way? Maybe why are we not doing things better? Maybe in this sort of environment where we're talking about today. And so one observation that I've had over the years, and one thing that I work to develop, is a safety interlock system when we provide an infusion of oxytocin. So a lot of times we have patients come to the floor to induce their labor, which is done with oxytocin to give contractions. If you imagine, if you have a lot of contractions, you're slowing blood flow to the fetus, and that can cause drops in the heart rate. And the half-life of that medication is relatively short. It's only about 3 or 4 minutes. But if you notice a problem or concern with the fetal heart tracing, you then have to identify it, run to the patient's room, stop the infusion to then assess further. There's lots of things going on. Or in the world of 10 years ago, Ebola, luckily we didn't see that on the labor floor, or more recently with COVID, you need to put on your PPE, pause, make sure that you're ready to go into the room. Those are minutes that are now adding up that could have adverse patient outcomes and adverse fetal outcomes. But if we had a system where an infusion pump could link with the fetal monitoring system and the contraction monitoring system, identify that there's a problem, maybe a drop in the heart rate, just pause an infusion of a medication that there's really no bad outcomes by just pausing the medication. That then starts the clock before you're even in the room to hopefully prevent a poor fetal outcome. But none of those systems exist right now. They exist in theory, and I think in general, it's a relatively simple engineering problem from what I hear, but we don't have it yet. And I think this opportunity to discuss with everyone a really real world, concrete example of something that could improve patient safety is why we're all here, but also it charges clinicians to come up with these questions to then find the link and use this as a conduit to go to the next step of creating those technologies. So,
thank you. Yeah, perhaps I ask you, how do you identify those pain points that clinicians and patients identify, and then how do you create the teams and the synergy that addresses them not only among the primary participants, but also engaging industry as co-developers?
So I think you heard Dr. Goldman and then Dr. Landman talk about how we're really hemorrhaging. I mean, people leaving the roles of medicine. And so I can even prove it neuroscientifically around moral injury. I know what my patient needs, but I can't meet those needs. And so my pain center is constantly lighting up. So to that end, what we've done is to create a platform to actively elicit pain points on the front line and their ideas for solution. And then we take those solutions and incubate them in my center. So that's one way. And what we're hearing is that staff feel empowered, and we're democratizing that whole process. We also just ran the same sort of thing with patients. What are your pain points as you engage with us through the health system? And we had them team up with a clinician, and then they developed their own solutions as well. And it's been really magical. So that's how we're doing it inwardly. Outwardly, we're really making a point to say, look, come, let's all develop these solutions together, because we deeply understand the problems and the workflow, and you have the infrastructure and the resources to help us build those. And that's what we're trying to do.
Paul, I invite you to provide perspectives on disaster responses and not having the right things in the right place at the right time.
Sure. So I think, there are going to be a lot of parallels, as you might expect, between my world and the previous military panel, in the sense that, we're trying to care for large numbers of injured or acutely ill patients. And there's so many ways in which some of the discussions that have already been had about technologies that exist are relevant in the disaster space, but we face some really predictable challenges that we just haven't figured a way around yet. So, in the case of the injured warfighter, I don't want to minimize that challenge. It's enormous, but we know where the conflict is. We can have the technology and the devices follow the warfighter and the conflict. From the perspective of civilian preparedness, we don't know where that next disaster is going to be. We know for sure that large-scale mass shooting events are increasing, but I can't tell you where the next one's going to be. We know that there are actually several parts of the country vulnerable to earthquake. We know, obviously, there are explosions, other things that can happen, but I cannot tell you where it's going to be. And so having a large cache of devices that will help me with patient triage, with patient monitoring, that are ready to go anywhere is really, really hard. I think there are probably some MBAs here in the audience, and early in business school, as you all know, the first thing you learn is excess capacity is waste. And yet what I want everybody to do is have excess capacity for patient monitoring and patient care. When that mass casualty event happens, to be able to pull out a cache of wearables, 200 wearables, 400 wearables, that can be put on the patient, that can give me that monitoring that I just don't have the staff to be able to do. I've got the nurses and physicians in an emergency department in the community that exist right then. It's really hard to mobilize them as quickly as they need to come from home, from outside of the community to augment the staff that are on duty. We need technology to be able to monitor the patients, to give us those heads up indicators that someone's oxygen saturation is falling, their blood pressure is changing. AI has so much promise in terms of even reading the waveform of the ECG to tell me who's at risk of deterioration. And yet we just don't have the devices at an affordable price point. Every CFO of a hospital system will laugh you out of the room if you say, please, I want to buy these, and I'm going to keep them on the shelf 99.9% of the time, not to be used. So the challenge is not just the technology, but making it affordable, making it deployable universally in a way that meets the reality of the event. Even if you put a couple in each state, it's probably not going to get to where the injured patients are in time, given the real epidemiology of how mass casualty events work. The one thing that I will also argue that's a little bit different is actually location access. If I put 40 patients in my hallway, if I put 500 patients throughout the lobbies, hallways of hospitals around Boston, and I've got this wonderful wearable technology I slapped on someone's forehead, and now it says, hey, they're about to go into cardiac arrest because they're hemorrhaging. Where is the patient? How do I possibly know? And these are real issues when you're using non-traditional spaces, as we do in disasters. Again, we take over lobbies, cafeterias, conference rooms, all these sorts of things. So a location access to link to the wearable technology is absolutely important. And lastly, I know we've said a lot about interoperability, but I do want to talk again about how critical this is. We've all of course, been through the COVID experience in different ways. Just give you the example that when we surged in our system during COVID, we struggled, like many, to get enough ventilators for the patients with acute respiratory illness in the first wave. And we actually, thankfully, through a lot of hard work, several folks here in the room who were critical in letting us do that, we were able to mobilize enough ventilators to deliver oxygen and pressure the way we need to. But the alarming systems did not integrate. And so I'm grateful, again, if anyone in the room was part of this, but we mobilized a ton of people from our research community who are not clinicians to sit outside rooms and listen for a ventilator alarm because we couldn't plug it into our central alarms. And when the ventilator alarm went, then they'd grab the nurse and say, hey, it's making a noise. That is the most basic level of interoperability, that we have to be able to have these devices share their alarms, share their alerts, so that when we surge, when we do more, we get the alerts, we get the sharing of information, just so we can assure the basic level of patient safety.
Well, you've got the perspective of decades of shepherding the development of an EHR system, and then more recently, interest in leveraging AI and emphasizing healthcare instead of intervention. How would you like to give the large perspective?
So unlike others, I don't have current experience where I'm applying where I'm using devices, but more the perspective really that probably I had at ONC, but it was influenced by the experience that I had VA. We're here today. 15% of our health is affected by healthcare. 95% of the dollars go into healthcare. That's the reality. And in private sector, it's a matter of survival. And we've survival in terms of being able to pay the bills, in terms of having expensive devices, and staff turnover. So lots of challenges. That's the reality, and that's important, and we've got to address that. It means that in the private sector, the innovation that we're talking about, the smart and autonomous systems, is going to start in critical care areas, in crisis areas, hopefully even out in EMS, so that we pick it up early. But that's where this is going to start. On the other hand, when you're doing a reference architecture, when you're thinking about where things need to go, make sure that you architect it for health and not just healthcare. So that as the prices drop, as the technology, and the technology does drop in terms of cost, becomes consumer level, consumer grade, that data can also be part of this interoperable smart environment. Maybe flagging it, in fact, that it's consumer grade, not medical grade. By the way, that'll drop the price significantly. But allowing that data to come in so that clinicians have access to it, flagged appropriately. Example, when I was at VA, we could monitor, we could get the patients remote monitoring data. But some clinicians were afraid to have it in the EHR because, I won't know how reliable it is. Well, make it a different color, make it a different flag. With AI, you can do not only the visual, but you can do the analysis. So we can take care of that rather than saying, oh, it's only consumer level, we can't use it. Let's use it, and let's broaden that. So the architecture needs to be able to accommodate that. AI will allow us to be able to handle massive amounts of data without being overwhelmed. It isn't something that we have to do within our heads. One thing that we see from the military was they have a couple of advantages. They're not profit-driven. They're mission-driven. For the military, and for the VA, it's also population. They're the at-risk, value-based system that isn't on the profit end, and maybe in the private sector, we need to finally make that transition on payment system, but that's a whole different ballgame and for another day. But it means that some of these things will in fact occur within the military and the VA and the government. That's where some of the early funding, the big funding that needs to push things forward and cause as the funding for MDM, PMP, and now for SaAMS. But they will also be looking at population because they care about the readiness of military personnel and the veteran population, even when they're outside the walls. So we want to move to health and care, which will keep more people out of the hospital. Now, that's another challenge. If you're profit-based, how do you accommodate less people coming into the ED and less people being hospitalized? But we're going to have to go through some changes in our healthcare system because we can see that what's going on now and the challenges of staffing and everything else is not scalable. There has to be a change. And for the SaAMS community, it's a matter of just keep that in the back of your mind. It's not going to be in the early part. We're going to have a phase 1 and phase 2, but you want to be able to scale into the consumer level. And in fact, that may be where most of our impact and benefit for the population may ultimately be.
Any thoughts here in the panel about how that might occur? That devices from smartwatches that record heart rates and maybe even atrial fibrillation, can be scaled. Converting them to entrepreneurial ventures and engaging people who ultimately need to make a profit or they won't have a viable product. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think using a lot of the human-centered design that we actually teach. So I love all the biosensors and the biophysical, but we have to think about, we can't have so many that it looks like you're wearing jewelry or something. So how do we take something that already exists? Let's take the glucose management pumps. They're so small, they're so easy, but can it now do more biochemical other than glucose, can now monitor other things? So we have to think about those kind of things. But and then from the patient's perspective, how do we get them to adopt it? Because lots of time, last night we were just talking about somebody wanted patients to come into a clinical trial that required them shaving their heads. They couldn't recruit anybody because nobody wanted to shave their heads. So just really looking at things from that perspective. But I do want to bring up two other things when you say about staff turnover is we've got to, I really worry when I walk around the units about our really experienced providers retiring, leaving, and these younger staff is still there. What do our clinical decision tools need to look like in the future as we address, and what technology are you going to give me to help me have eyes on my patients so we prevent falls, we prevent pressure injuries, et cetera. So supplementing my work so I can actually take care of the patient.
I think the point about blurring the lines between consumer and full medical grade is really important. I think, we have so many devices that people are willing to wear right now. Some of you may have the ring that I can't pronounce, or the Apple Watch, or the other thing. And, why not be able to leverage that, or why not be able to create sort of a standard that blurs between what we could do in a disaster and what we can leverage from the devices people have now. Certainly, it may lower the price point. And I do think we probably need support from regulators for this, that in X kind of declared disaster, the FDA might let us use devices in a different way than we use normal patient monitoring devices. But if the reality is that we can't afford really expensive caches of complex monitors, I think we have to look to other systems and strategies to try and bridge that gap. The reality is 100% that we will not have more nurses and physicians that magically appear in the middle of a mass casualty event. And so we have to give them help. We have to be able to extend their capabilities with the technology that's available.
I think that your point of health versus healthcare is so powerful. And we need to ensure that that still is the overarching theme of what's bringing everything together, is improving health and patient safety. It has to happen through this care delivery system, but also really connecting the clinicians who are day-to-day on the floor, in the units, interacting with patients, to ensure that health and what, as a clinician, what I can provide for my patient is really at the forefront, and that we have a seat at the table to ensure that those goals are highlighted as different technologies are created. But that stakeholder seat is really important. And I think this opportunity and having everyone here to start that conversation is really critical going forward.
I think one of the things to realize is the healthcare sector, we're not a system yet, the healthcare sector is really pretty small compared to the consumer sector. And prices drop when you have a large market. One of the tensions the government regulatory groups often have is having medical grade versus not medical grade, right? If you make it 80%, but you cover a large population, you actually improve the health of the population better than if you try and hold it to medical grade and the higher cost associated with it. So sometimes trading off for slightly less than perfect still means you get much better outcomes. And so we need to kind of look at that edge. There are needs for the medical grade, but we may not want to put quite as many barriers to the consumer grade products, because overall we'll all be better. And by the way, we talk about healthcare, medical care, we're all part of that population that ultimately may need, probably will need care, or certainly our family does. And so we all have stories, as we heard, of adverse events, adverse experiences in the healthcare system, both critical care, on the wards, in long-term care, especially where the staffing is incredibly short, and then at home where people were, they could have been at risk, but you didn't know, and yet suddenly something adverse happens. In my area of psychiatry, we are not very good at predicting suicide, but we know people who might be at risk for it. And if we have tools, technologies that monitor things about motion in people who are depressed or manic depressive, or other kinds of activities that they might do, we may be able to detect earlier as they are starting to deteriorate. So even in the less medical arenas, having that continuous monitoring, low intrusion can be very, very important.
Ariella, you mentioned earlier using home glucose monitoring for the gestational diabetic as an example of using consumer level technology to improve medical care.
There's two areas that really come to mind for high-risk individuals who are pregnant are those with diabetes and also high blood pressure. And we, as clinicians, rely on patients to do a lot of home monitoring. And for diabetics, that's either finger sticks or people are starting to use continuous glucose monitoring to be able to make medication adjustments and also bring people in sometimes for inpatient management to optimize their care. But we have ways to get continuous glucose monitoring into the cloud, and that can be evaluated at appointments, but not for finger sticks. And it is it's a home device. And some people may say, well, is it at a level? Can we rely on that data the same way that we would a glucometer that's used in the hospital? Because there is a discrepancy. I think it's a 10 or 20% margin of error that's allowed for home glucometers. And it's a problem, but trend is also really important when making medication adjustments. So thinking of that as an example, or home blood pressure monitoring, plenty of people do not measure their blood pressure sort of in a correct way. But again, the trend is still really important. And so maybe being able to flag it or color code it. This is a home device. It was done at home, but it still is a really important piece of information to be able to get into, an EHR or somewhere, a tool that we can use to affect changes in the care regimen maybe that we're providing while patients are at home, and hopefully prevent an inpatient admission or a more serious outcome. Those are really key examples for what we can be doing for a major portion of the population.
Rob, you've emphasized using consumer level devices as useful, yet the degree of technological sophistication of our patients ranges from extreme, especially in younger patients, to almost non-existent in the elderly patients. Do you have any insight into how to overcome those, or the isolated rural patient versus the urban patient?
So I think we're at level 0.5 in terms of self-monitoring devices. They take a lot of effort. You have to be motivated. You may sometimes need to be technically sophisticated. There is a pipeline of small sensors that still is not yet at the level that you'd want to trust it. In many cases, one of the people here had run the testing lab to compare those devices, and we're still early in that. But that's a technology that's going to improve. And what I envision is something that you basically, like the continuous glucose monitor, place someplace. It stays there. You don't have to do anything. And it actually, they're getting more and more sophisticated to where you can measure a variety of parameters, both physiologic and chemical, and things like blood pressure without having to know how to put the cuff on right or remember to do it or anything else. So those advances, I think, will occur. Again, we're looking out 10 to 20 years, but then for SaAMS, they're looking out well beyond that, putting the foundation for something that will scale. So as far as we're not going to, maybe somebody will make a big breakthrough, but that'll come in the consumer level most likely, and again, be slightly less than perfect. I think that'll take care of itself. We want to make sure that as we look at scaling with AI being able to handle large volumes of data and kind of detect some of the noise and ignore that abnormal reading, just like an anesthesiologist would ignore something that just spikes and there's just a problem there, but it's not a trend. I think the devices themselves will make it easier and simpler for people who are not sophisticated to just be able to use it easily.
Yeah, specifically technology making things simple, even for people who don't understand how or why. And Paul, you can't have your 500 or 1,000 devices on the shelf. So where can technology help us with training people behaviorally to be able to react to unforeseen situations?
Thanks. I think, I don't mean to suggest that the only solutions are in these almost never use case scenarios. I think there's a lot we can do with daily use that will improve our readiness in disaster. We know for sure that triage, especially emergency triage, still is pretty poor. In most emergency departments, we have cases where someone looks pretty well and then decompensates later, and even sophisticated nurses and physicians didn't pick up on it early. And I think there's a lot of opportunity there because every single patient that comes to an emergency department gets triaged to develop more sophisticated algorithms, more sophisticated devices. All of us can remember the tricorder from the Star Trek days that you just waved over someone and it magically knew exactly what was going on. Help in that way, because anything that helps in daily triage, which clearly has a good business case for it, helps us in disaster, especially if it's fast. And I think for technologies that we use in the daily use scenario, always just asking that additional question of how could it be used in disaster better really helps. So again, triage, it's not uncommon for a triage encounter to take 2, 3, 5 minutes for an emergency care encounter, but that doesn't work at scale when you have 200 people. So it has to go much faster if you're trying to process a large number of people in a short period of time. Ultrasound has become a key technology in so many areas of medicine, and we rely on the clinician being trained to appropriately acquire and interpret the image. And there is some work in this arena, but if we instead really need to have less sophisticated or more a broader group of providers trying to gather ultrasound images and make decisions, we can build in supports for the ultrasound technology that tells you how to hold the probe. Are you in the right place? Are you not in the right place? And certainly help, just like Adam was showing with the EKG interpretation, much better support for the ultrasound interpretation, right? Yes, I see hemorrhage. No, I don't see hemorrhage. Yes, I see X or Y. And so just that extra step with daily technology to say, what could I tweak that maybe isn't going to add a ton of cost to the device, but that makes it much better to help us augment either care capability or capacity in a disaster, I think is really important.
And adaptation of devices, it's been said that the ultrasound is the stethoscope of the present. And yet many health systems resist that technology and say, it's not mature. We don't know how to integrate it. Can't let people make decisions on things that aren't vetted. How do we overcome these hurdles?
I think, increasing that analogy, I hate to say, is insulting to ultrasound, given how few clinicians use their stethoscope well these days. I think, people prefer to get an X-ray of the chest and rarely listen to the lungs. I think, again, we have to get good validated data on on the accuracy of these interpretations. But, you know, many of you know, probably many of you are more sophisticated than I in this, but, you know, when we do a CAT scan actually acquires more data than it can display to the radiologist or to the viewer. And therefore our interpretation sort of as a human is much more limited than what the device ultimately can interpret. And if you train it on a large enough data set, it can actually be better than humans and see things that we don't see in what's the visual representation on the screen. It can make diagnoses more accurately. And I believe the same is true with other technologies, particularly ultrasound. And so it's really just about developing bigger projects that train on larger data sets with good, accurate feedback, obviously on the correct diagnoses, but also on that are integrated with the other parameters available for the patient. So not just what does the picture look like, but what were the vital signs at that time? What else did we know about that patient? Training on these bigger data sets, I think will give us AI-supported sophistication that addresses those questions you're mentioning, that yes, I may not be a board-certified radiologist, but the device is giving me a really reliable suggestion of what is likely going on that can be actionable in a way that actually protects patients, doesn't harm patients.
Well, and Dr. Landman cited two examples on the EKG and the looking at the fundus of data that's there that's beyond anything that we would have guessed you could extract from it. And that's early, it'll get better and better, but there is data there that we never could imagine.
And I would just add that when I'm monitoring fetal heart rate and contraction monitoring, that interpretation is solely based on my eyes and my training. And we work as a team, and there are many people watching the board, but that is totally reliant on our interpretation. And so there really is room to start to incorporate AI and different algorithms to be able to take the actual parameters and say, this is this category, which would be a good thing, or another category, which would be ominous and you need to be in the operating room, but without just my personal take on it, essentially. There's a lot of data to be able to feed into that. And many patients to train on with that data.
To re-emphasize Colonel Pamplin's comment that we need data spaces to accumulate this, because AI and machine learning are dependent more than anything else on large data sets. In order to, and then to have the feedback, for instance, of chest X-rays and ultrasounds, that the incident when the patient had an examination in the emergency room was because they might be hemorrhaging or might have appendicitis, but they actually have an aortic aneurysm or a chest nodule, and that wasn't the focus of the moment, so it was forgotten until the system picks it up later and calls it back to the attention of the radiologist to take care of the patient before they're in a catastrophic situation. Thank you all very much. And for your comments, any other final summary statements? Okay.